we see this like working with the elite military units that we work with, like the Green Berets. They all anthropometrically kind of look the same. And honestly, when I went under selection to be an astronaut, all the men that I went under selection with, they all looked the same. Like we were all literally the same size, male and female. All of us that made it to that second and third final round, we were anthropometrically the same.
Hey everybody, welcome to Mops and Mo's. This is Drew and Alex. Alex, who do we have today?
This is a pretty good one. We got Allison Brager. She's one of the Army's very few active duty neuroscientists. She specializes in sleep, particularly in extreme environments and high stress situations. Beyond the DoD, she's worked with organizations like NASA and NATO. And on top of that, she's an extremely accomplished athlete in her own right, with multiple appearances at the CrossFit Games, as well as being an athlete on the U.S. Army Warrior Fitness Team. Most recently, she is the Deputy Chief Science Officer at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School.
And if you like the things that we talk about today, mostly around sleep and performance and how that affects sort of the neurobiology, she's also written a book entitled Meathead, Unraveling the Athletic Brain, which you can find anywhere books are sold, Amazon, etc.
And you can follow her on Instagram at DocJockZZZ. And I think you'll really enjoy this conversation. It's a pretty good discussion of like realistic sleep interventions for tactical professionals.
Don't fall asleep.
Yeah, so basically, they selected us for the team. We came to Fort Knox, did a full-time PCS there. We competed pretty decently, did really well up through COVID, survived COVID, and started competing again. But then we had this huge change in leadership where, honestly, I think they were just haters. They just they couldn't do CrossFit and even take the time to understand what it was. And they also had this sentiment that the officers needed real officer jobs, because it wasn't fair that we got to work out all day, because that's literally all they thought we did was just work out for the sake of working out. So I actually got lucky in that I got a command position. Mm-hmm. The rest of the officers, unfortunately, got put in staff positions, which honestly would be my worst nightmare, because that would be the worst job for me. I would be an absolutely terrible staff officer. I know that about myself. I'm a good leader, but a terrible staff officer. And also, I didn't join the Army to be a staff officer, to be honest with you.
As a career staff officer, I can understand that.
I was going to say a lot of things about Alex, but I just decided not to. I thought he might swoop in and save himself.
I have, with rare exceptions, pretty much always been a staff officer, but it's okay.
Here's the thing. I could do it. I'm not going to enjoy it. I could do it, but it's not my passion.
That's fair.
Did you join the Army as a neuroscientist?
I did. Yeah. So I came to the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research on this fellowship through the National Academies of Sciences. That's actually how they hire a lot of their neuroscientists and faculty at RARE. And then, my first day there, the department chair of military psychiatry and neuroscience, he was like, "Hey, you'd make a great Army officer. Have you ever considered joining?" And so, I told him how I got recruited by West Point, wanted to go there, but then our country went to war the year I graduated high school. So my parents weren't thrilled at all about that. So, I told him, I was like, yeah, sure. Second chance. And no, it's been cool. It's been good.
And these are a series of naive questions, but did you come into it interested in sleep, or did sleep come about as you sort of developed and grew and all that?
No, so I've been a sleep researcher for almost 20 years. So I worked, when I was an undergrad at Brown, I took a psychology of sleep course my sophomore year. first I took it because I heard it was an easy A. And that the athletes at Brown, we sort of did that. Like we try to find courses throughout our demanding training schedule that would give us an easy A. So I took that course and I just fell in love with it. So from sophomore year on, I worked her name's Dr. Mary Carskadden. She actually almost got the Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine a few years ago for, remember when they gave it to the group of scientists who discovered the circadian clock? So she was in the running for it because she's actually the one who's responsible for the later school start times in high school now. Because she did all that research to show that adolescents, when they progress through puberty, have a naturally delayed sleep rhythm. And if you better align their delayed sleep rhythm and delayed wake time with later school start times, they actually perform better in school. So yeah, I've been doing sleep research for almost 20 years.
I'm trying to think in high school. I think we started at like 7:15, which in hindsight was probably too early.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's way too early. So I think
You're
it's
wrong,
like,
but I think that's right.
yeah, I think it's a state by state basis, but the states that have adopted it, I mean, they're starting their high schools around like 8:20.
Yeah, we were definitely earlier than 8:20, if I remember correctly. And now, I mean, the Army starts at, I don't know, the Army doesn't stop, really.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess you said you didn't join the Army to be a staff officer. What is like the prototypical Army neuroscientist career? Like what does normal look like in that domain? Because that's not something I'm familiar with at all.
Yeah, it's actually honestly, it's a really cool journey if you let it. So you sort of weave in and out of doing, large scale clinical studies, mostly in your area of expertise. So most of us come, with some understanding of neuroblast trauma, PTSD, some scope of military psychiatry. And then when you're not doing that research, either spearheading a lab or, being the director, say department chair at Walter Reed, for example, you're teaching at West Point, you're teaching at USIS, you might even be teaching at like DIU. And then we spend the rest of our time, we all have to be acquisitions officers. That's sort of a requirement for any PhD. And that's basically like overseeing the partnerships and agreements between industry and academia. So it's pretty cool because in your career, like, I've already been to the recruiting command. I'm at JFK School of Special Warfare now. I could go to Defense Innovation University. I could do something at DARPA. Like we can just sort of float in and out of different commands of the Army and like, partnerships with the Army through DARPA, NIH, any of the other federal agencies.
So what you're saying is there are in fact Army careers out there where you can like follow what you're interested in and like strictly do what you signed up to do.
I mean, you have to be persistent though. You know what I mean? Like I make it very clear to people. There are 38 people in our AOC from captain all the way up to colonel, 38 people. So I make it very clear to them, I am one of 38 total and honestly like one of 5 neuroscientists. So you better be using me for what I'm for, because if not, like I will leave and I will make a lot more money, but I love what I do. So I really do enjoy my time in the Army. But those are the negotiations I have up front. And it is luck too, because, we had a really bad command leadership situation less than a year ago. And I called up, I was in this movement cycle to PCS, and I basically called up my consultant, because we have a consultant of our AOC who works with HRC to help us get what we want. And so I called her up and told her what was happening. And she's like, oh, we got to get you out of here. And so they called HRC and they moved my PCS timeline up by 7 or 8 months.
I will say the Army can be flexible or fast when it wants to be. I was in a similar situation at one point where I told Branch the job I wanted. I told them I would leave if they didn't give me that job, and they gave me orders to PCS like 2 weeks later.
Yeah.
Like not a 2-week wait to get the orders. I got the orders in a day, and my arrival date was 2 weeks later.
Oh, wow. Well, they kind of did that with the CrossFit team, honestly. Like we waited and waited for our orders. And I remember the orders came May 22nd, and we were all moving by like June 16th or something. So I get it.
Yep. It was pretty wild. You can just call the moving office and tell them it's like an urgent move, and they can just make it happen. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, I refuse to let the Army move me anymore because my first Army move was a terrible horror story. So
mine have all gone well. I don't know.
Well, you're very lucky.
I don't know if that's setting me up. I did just see one of my old NCOs from my last assignment. All of his household goods burned down by the side of the road, like the whole trailer. So like all of his family stuff and 2 other families that were on the same trailer, it's gone. Like
I know a guy who went overseas and all of his stuff sunk.
Jeez.
Oh my God. Okay. So I thought mine was bad. My stuff got moved into my neighbor's already furnished apartment. And she at the time was in London for work. So I had to call the DC police, and like literally myself, my other neighbors, and the police helped move my shit into my own apartment. And like every time I used to see the police officers in around Georgetown and DC ever since, like they remember this like night in DC with me.
It's more entertaining, at least.
That's awesome.
Yeah, she was so pissed though, but she couldn't do anything about it. She was literally on the other side of the Atlantic.
But how did they get into her place to put all your stuff in it?
Okay, so I made it very clear that there was no key. There was no key to my apartment. It was this apartment. I get there and I was like, where the hell is my stuff? And so I called the moving company, and they're like, oh yeah, we found the key under the mat. And I was like, what? And then I was like, oh my God, it's in my neighbor's apartment. And they literally took all my stuff and put it on her stuff. So like it was a nightmare, and they broke some of her stuff. But yeah, that's why I will never let the Army move me again.
That's terrifying.
Jeez.
We should disclaimer for anybody who's listening to this that you are in a gym. So like the random loud crashes behind you are under control and everything's fine.
Oh yes. Yeah.
That's what I told her when she logged on. I was like, that's the best podcast flex I can think of, is just to like do it in a gym.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yep. If you don't mind the claim, Dave.
Can you talk about, I mean, this is kind of a shameless plug for you, but can you speak to your book? Because I think inevitably people are going to hear this and want to learn more. And I want to point out that there is in fact more that you can learn.
Yeah, sure. So my book covers more or less the neuroscience of athleticism. And really this idea of what separates neuroscientifically an elite athlete from an amateur. There was an article that came out years and years ago that this great scientific journalist wrote named Carl Zimmer about how the brain of an elite athlete is incredibly efficient. And I just, I was really struck by the idea, and I was in a position at the time to sort of write this book. One, because I always used to teach the neuroscience course when I was a postdoc fellow at Morehouse College. So I did my postdoc in Atlanta, Georgia, in sleep medicine, and spent my time between Morehouse School of Medicine and Emory. But I taught part-time at Morehouse College. So anyway, I was, like neuroscience was fresh in my mind when I had this idea. And then 2, we had just qualified for our first CrossFit Games as a team. And so I sort of was like, oh no, this might be the only time in my life if I'm relevant. So I wrote it for that reason too. And so I really just spent like a whole year and a half, mostly on like, I was in a long distance relationship at the time. So I used to take the Greyhound like every other week to Savannah. So I wrote most of that book on the Greyhound traveling to and from Atlanta to Savannah over the course of a year and a half.
what is I mean, not to like, I guess to keep it relatively general, what were some of the key differences between the two in terms of amateur and professional?
So speed of just basically energy expenditure. So when you're, comes down to like muscle memory and like building this robust network of connectivity between movement patterns and the execution of those movement patterns that the brain controls. Is the more you do it, right, the more efficient it becomes, and the more efficient it becomes, the less energy you have to expend. So basically, the best way to put it is like the brain of an elite athlete is like a Formula One car in the idle position. Like it's waiting to go from 0 to 200 in 4 seconds. But it could do that, and it can do that very, very quickly. Whereas an amateur brain is more like a 1967 Pontiac, where it's going to take a lot more energy and a lot more resources to go that fast. And it's not even going to get that fast that quickly, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I guess it's kind of a learned skill versus something that you would be innately born with, or is it something you're born with?
So I do think there is an argument for nature versus nurture. One, because that's actually my background is genetics. So behavioral genetics is a large part of what I do in the sleep field. Is I look at how unique naturally occurring mutations in one's genetic code lend to certain sleep traits or like performance traits. And some people, like, they are born for the sport that they compete in because of how they mobilize energy resources. You see this when you look at a lot of Norwegian or like, let's use the Icelandic CrossFitters as an example. Like they have this means of efficiently utilizing glucose, fats, all those energy reserves more so than the average population. And there's actual genes that can be traced back to these like metabolic traits. So it's a combination of both.
Can you select for that as you look to, because I'm thinking of a lot of these countries, especially at like the Olympic level, when we think of China, Russia, previously Soviet Union, like selecting for athletes that can compete at that level. Can you select for those types of things, those mutations?
Oh, absolutely. But the thing is like whether people or unknowingly do this, like look at any elite population, especially in athletes, right? Like you talk about anthropometric features, they all look the same. Like I remember the first time I went to the Power Monkey fitness camp that the former Olympic gymnast Dave Durante runs. He and all his former buddies on the Olympic team all look the same. The Olympic rowers they had there all look the same. The Olympic weightlifting coaches they had there all look the same. I mean, it's the same thing in like CrossFit's kind of becoming that way too. If you look at a lot of the game athletes and like what sports they came from. We see this like working with the elite military units that we work with, like the Green Berets. They all anthropometrically kind of look the same. And honestly, when I went under selection to be an astronaut, all the men that I went under selection with, they all looked the same. Like we were all literally the same size, male and female. All of us that made it to that second and third final round, we were anthropometrically the same.
Drew said earlier that the ultimate podcast flex is just like coming out of the podcast from a gym. I don't know if that holds up to just like casually dropping the fact that you went through astronaut selection mid podcast as a flex.
Well, I mean, I didn't make it, but
that's okay.
You got several rounds farther. You got several rounds farther in astronaut selection than I did.
Yeah,
so.
Same. Yeah. I never even went to space camp. So
I didn't go to space camp either. I mean, I guess I kind of sort of went through.
You did. You went to astronaut selection. That is space camp on steroids. Yeah. But I remember you talking about like anthropometrics. I remember David Epstein wrote The Sports Gene, and he has.
Yes, that's one of my favorite books.
Yeah, he has a TED talk where he literally talks about this, and he shows the graph. And I forget around the 1950s, he shows where you see this explosion of body types. And I think what he got to is if you're over 7 feet tall, or, you know, a series of, you're 1 in 3 chance of being in the NBA or something like that. But to your point, like swimmers all kind of look the same. Weightlifters kind of look the same. It's super interesting.
Oh yeah, for sure. My ex-husband, he swam with, he grew up swimming with Ryan Lochte, and he swam at Michigan with Phelps. And like, yeah, they like when they all have reunions and stuff, like they all look the same. Like, yeah, that's just how it is. I'm actually next fall, I'm teaching a behavioral genetics course. And instead of using the textbook, I'm actually going to use David Epstein's The Sports Gene book, because I think it's like, it is just an incredible read. And he just takes such a deep dive as a journalist.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see if we can possibly pivot this slightly more towards the tactical side of this conversation. And I think one piece of it that we've talked about before on this podcast is that kind of like pre-selection for certain body types doesn't happen in the conventional tactical population. So you have to train a really like genetically and body type diverse group of people in a way that's largely one size fits all. And you had a really good point when we spoke a couple weeks ago about like the genetic factors in people's resilience against sleep deprivation. And I was hoping you could dive into that one a little bit, just in terms of, we make these assumptions that people respond to that sleep deprivation the same way, and you pointed out that they really don't.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, honestly, I've spent almost 20 years looking at the genetics and molecular factors that make somebody resilient or sensitive to sleep deprivation. I did this in many years in mice, mostly because we were able to discover this protein factor in skeletal muscle that regulates the ability to be resilient to sleep deprivation. That's literally what I spent 5 years doing. And it's sort of my like claim to fame in the field, is discovering this protein. But even outside of like looking at animal models, if you look at humans, and this is something we did at Walter Reed, is when you put people under extreme schedules of sleep deprivation that mimic what operators go through, you can start to see separation based on their naturally occurring genetic framework. And if you look at select genes that are related to how sleep is regulated, that's where you see the differences. Is certain people, there's 2 genes in particular. One's called PER2, PER2, and the other one is called ADORA2A. It's related to this molecule on my forearm called adenosine. If you look at the expression of these 2 genes and naturally occurring differences, they do differ between people who perform pretty decently throughout this extended sleep deprivation that's greater than 48 hours on most occasions, compared to people who, start failing about 10 hours in of being awake. And, I think part of that is part of the reason why there are, this is what we're selecting for, right? At Ranger School, during Q course, during any of these at Penn schools is, we've never done genetic testing on any of these candidates and graduates of these courses, but I guarantee if we did, we would find a lot of these same genetic mutations that we see in our resilient people in the lab, because those courses self-select for people who are resilient to sleep deprivation and resilient to stress.
And is that something that can be trained, or is that pretty innately kind of programmed in?
No, I come from the camp of researchers that it's innate, because think about it. You've had this your whole life, right? And by the time you start training this, you're way past that imprinting period, as we call, like you're a full grown adult. This is how your brain is wired. This is how you like metabolically and energetically like use resources. So like you might be able to tweak little things here and there. But really, even if you are tweaking things, you're only really going to see this at the elite level, right? Because it goes back to David Epstein's point. Like at the elite level, genetically, they're pretty much like all the same, right? Because they're the 1% or less than 1% for that particular skill set. So when you start adding on things like sleep and nutrition and all these other domains, then that's where you could see the separation. But in the general population, there's so much genetic variability to begin that these little things aren't, I mean, they're going to make a difference overall, but they're not going to make a huge difference in the grand scheme of performance. Like they're not going to go from amateur to elite, like just like that.
Do you, because I know it's going to happen with people that listen to this, they're going to just self-determine whether or not they are in possession of this gene or not. Is there a way, I mean, outside of genetic testing, I think I know the answer to this is no, but is there a way to kind of determine whether or not you would in fact be more resilient to that? Or is it just by virtue of going through these experiences?
Yeah, you have to go through the experiences of sleep deprivation to know if you are sleep deprived, you know, like I figured out that, I mean, honestly, that's the way I figured it out. And then I did the 23andMe test and I learned that I am like sleep resilient. Maybe I could use Chandler as an example, Alex. Like Chandler's really dialed in his nutrition. And I know he did an article recently, I think for Men's Health or something. And he's like, I think being on this nutritional plan is helping, but I'm not quite sure. I mean, I think that's a great example, right? Like don't get me wrong, Chandler works his ass off. I've seen it every single day, like even before it was his teammate. But like, you know, he also has like the perfect framework to be an elite athlete in the sport.
It's so that kind of brings up the question I'm most interested in, because this is how we like extrapolate this out to the larger conventional military population or the tactical population in general. You basically just said resilience against sleep deprivation is pretty innate and largely not trainable, especially once you're already an adult anyway. So then where do you stand on the utility of sleep deprivation during training events? Because that's something that's like culturally pretty foundational to how we do business here.
It's in vogue.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing is if you're not resilient to sleep deprivation to begin, like not all hope is lost, right? If you maintain a strict sleep routine, and even if you start incorporating napping, in the face of sleep deprivation, if you have a really robust sleep schedule leading up to that, you could actually have pretty stable performance across that sleep deprivation. Now, for the normal like soldier who comes in like already chronically sleep deprived, he or she is not going to do well during that sleep deprivation, especially if they don't have these like innate, you know, genetic attributes. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But really sleep deprivation, like it should be reserved for when it matters, right? Like it shouldn't just ultimately happen every single day of every single selection, because at that point, everyone's going to be chronically sleep deprived. And when you're chronically sleep deprived, it doesn't matter if you have sleep resilient genes or not, like everyone's going to perform poorly. So I should like, I guess, caveat it in that these sleep resilient genes only really come out in periods of acute sleep deprivation that are offset by bouts of like normal sleep.
So there's not a gene that makes it so it's totally fine for you to be sleep deprived all the time. It's like resilience. How long can you go in an acute period of sleep deprivation before you start running into the same problems as everybody else? Exactly.
Unless you're somebody like who is a short sleeper. So there is this one gene called DEC2, DEC2. And these are people who truly only need 2 to 4 hours of sleep a night. Like their ability to replenish the energy reserves and go through these recovery processes of sleep are so great that they can sleep for 2 hours and sleep like those of us who sleep 8 hours. Like they're just lucky.
See, what's going to happen now, I'm going to have people showing up with Bang energy drinks being like, oh, I got that. I got that deck 2 thing she talked about. All I need is 48 minutes of sleep. I'm good to go, man. Deck 2.
No, that's not how it is. It's like, we're talking like US presidents, Fortune 500 CEOs, and Elon Musk. You know, that's like literally all we're talking about. Those
And
people.
your average E4.
This is exactly what gets me worried, though, because like I remember when I was a cadet, right? And like you'd put those like key leader type of personalities on a pedestal of like, this is how you need to operate so you can get to their level. And it was your like McChrystal and Petraeus were like the guys at the time.
Yeah.
And both of them were like legendary for like not sleeping a lot and running a ton and eating one meal a day and all this stuff.
Yep.
And there was the idea that like, because it works for them and they achieve at a really high level, it should work for everybody else. And there's to a certain degree that happens kind of like at every echelon in the Army is we put everybody into a meat grinder and a few people pop out on the other side doing great. And they think because it worked for them that it should work for everybody else. And what we're saying here is that is not the case. Those things are exceedingly rare. And that is not how you develop a healthy, capable force.
Yes, you couldn't have said it better. It's like they are literally the point like 0.0001% of the population.
Is there an appetite for genetic testing as part of the whole, traditional selection process that you've seen? Is that even on the table?
No, I think just because of the history itself during World War II and the ethical considerations around it. Now, here's the thing. I think it can be done, but it has to be the right time in the selection process. Like, for example, we can use like the Q course, for example. Maybe after they go through traditional selection and they graduate and they're trying to figure out like which ODA to go to and which team, like you could do a genetic screen and see what physiological attributes would best serve them based on missions. I'll use myself as an example. I always used to think I was like a pure anaerobic power athlete because I was a gymnast my entire life. And then I was a pole vaulter heptathlete at Brown. And it turns out I'm actually like mixed muscle fiber type. And like, once I found that out, I started training my CrossFit programming different, like started approaching my CrossFit programming differently. And like, I started having huge success. So I think, at a certain point past selection, if you leverage it to figure out like doing this person's sustained job, because selection is only one part of the puzzle. Like you have to find a way to keep these guys healthy and resilient for either 19 more years or 4 more years. And if you can put them in the right job based on their genetic and like true physiological framework, like I don't see any harm. And, I feel like that's more ethically acceptable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's clearly pitfalls in terms of like the ethical considerations of deciding people's careers based on genetic analysis. I just kind of want to know if I can get some exogenous DEC2. Like, can I get it in a bottle?
DEC4.
Yeah, there we go.
We used to, when we discovered this protein factor, we isolated this protein factor in skeletal muscle. It's called BMAL1. It's also present in the brain, but it's widely expressed in the skeletal muscle. We like naively thought we could engineer this somehow and create like an injectable form of like BMAL1 in humans. And like, all of a sudden you'd be like acutely resilient to sleep deprivation and also be able to run marathons. Cause that was like the weird thing about these mice that overexpress this protein factor is they were super resilient to sleep deprivation, but they also could like they ran like 6 or 7 times more than the average mouse. Believe it or not, mice like to like run on a treadmill, and they like never got tired. They were basically like the Petraeuses and crystals. They like didn't sleep. They loved to run all day, every freaking day. They barely ate, and they were super lean.
Someone at the Pentagon's about to call you with a whole bunch of research money and a new project for you to go work on.
Well, or my mentor, he's still kind of working on the problem. He's at UCLA now, but yeah, I'll tell Katema.
So if he's still working on it, that means it's not totally off the table. That
Alex is over here trying to be like, hey, so can I get some of that?
Well, he's still trying. We're still trying to like figure out the mechanism in mice before we we venture to the clinical realm. But yeah, I mean, I'm sure he'll gladly accept a DoD, check at any time.
I'm willing to be a test subject. I don't know about cash. I don't have a lot of that, but I can be a test
Oh,
subject.
I would be a test subject too. I mean, I'm not even associated with that stuff anymore. So I'm with you. I'll do it.
Have you seen anybody succeed in that space despite their genetic profile? If that makes sense. Like what I'm thinking is a situation where like maybe after some testing, I present as somebody who is not resilient to sleep deprivation as an example, but then you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there are exceptions. Okay, let's use the sport of basketball as an example. I don't, you guys are younger than me, but do you guys remember Muggsy Bogues?
I was just about to say
Toronto Raptors.
I was just okay. Well, first of all, my Muggsy Bogues played for the Charlotte Hornets. So
okay. Yeah, mine was the Toronto Raptors.
Yeah, of course, Muggsy Bogues.
Like look at that guy. Like he is probably the best example in sports of like beating the odds. How tall was he? Was he like, he probably was 5'8", but
no, my mom, if my mom listens to this, she'll know because he would come because I'm from Charlotte. So he would be part of what they called Books and Bugs when the Hornets players would come and do.
Oh,
and
yeah.
So my mom is short. I love you, Mom. She's short. And she and him were of, kindred spirits. I think he's like 5'4".
Yeah, that's what I thought. I thought he was like 5'4" or 5'5".
Now I'm going to Google
look it up right now. Yeah. But like that's a perfect example, right? There are anomalies. Even with this framework, there are anomalies. Now, when it comes to sleep deprivation, it's different because sleep is a direct result of lack of energy reserves. Like once you have used up all your ATP, all your glucose, all your fats, and you can no longer replenish your basic biochemical energy reserves, you sleep. Like that's the purpose of sleep, is to replace these energy reserves. And so I think, athletics is one thing, but with sleep, there might be a few anomalies, but it's hard for me to believe there are because nothing can replace sleep but actual sleep. Like that's the thing we say. Like even when we do our caffeine dosing studies where we strategically dose people with caffeine to keep their performance stabilized during sleep deprivation, after 3 days, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you have the genetic framework or you don't have the genetic framework to be resilient to sleep deprivation, you crash after 3 days with caffeine because your body's like, I need sleep right now. Like I have no energy reserves left in the tank. I'm going to sleep. So
two things.
I think sleep is very unique in that regard.
One thing, Muggsy Bogues was 5'3", so we were off.
Oh shit!
By an inch.
He's shorter than me.
5'3". And then second thing, so what you're telling me is this story popped up. I think it was on BBC or something the other day, and it was this World War I soldier who I believe survived being blown up or something like that, but then apparently didn't sleep for 40 years. You're telling me that was a lie.
I gotta check that one.
He didn't have restorative sleep. That's, my friends who are sleep medicine docs can tell you all the time about people who come to the sleep lab and are like, I didn't sleep. I don't sleep. And then they argue with them about, no, that can't be wrong. I didn't get 6.5 hours of sleep. No, granted, it's not good sleep. It's light stages of sleep, not the restorative sleep, but.
Is there a way, I mean, getting into some of the tangible type stuff, is there a way to, and I don't want to say this because it's going to sound like to sleep hack? Because you'll see I don't know what it's called, but where you nap every hour or something and you can go forever. Is that stuff, is there meat to that, or is that largely?
No.
Okay.
No, okay. So here's the thing. I know what you're talking about because Tim Ferriss is the guy who he talked about it in 4 Hour Body.
Yep.
It is an interesting concept because it does sort of exploit the physiological process that drives sleep, which is core body temperature. So the idea was every time your core body temperature drops, your brain and your body wants to be in the state of energy conservation, which is sleep, which happens about 4 or 5 times in a day. But as soon as you deviate from that schedule, and he makes note of this, you are so jacked up that it literally takes your body like 4 or 5 times as long to recover. So yeah, it might work short term, but it's not by any means healthy at all.
I'll ask one in that same vein. And there was a bunch of research happening about it when I was in high school. I think I remember reading about it then and like for a couple of years after. But this idea of like, so the research was on binaural beats and their like potential ability to like accelerate the process of sleep, essentially, which is in like the same vein as that. Was there anything to that? Was that just kind of like a flash in the pan and it didn't pan out? What was the deal?
No, so actually there's a lot of research for that, and we did that research at Rare. So you know, and this kind of research like makes you realize just how many like brilliant mad scientists there are in the world. I'm not one of those people, but there are people like Dr. John Hughes and Dr. Alan Brown at Walter Reed that came up with this stuff. Like, there's a reason why the both of them were like the former directors of NIH institutes. But yeah, so there's this pathway called the thalamic cortical pathway, and it's directly tied to the initiation and it's tied to the initiation of sleep and then the consolidation of sleep. And for whatever reason, receiving like a noise frequency at a particular brainwave state like stimulates this thalamocortical loop and can help initiate sleep. That's like the easiest way to describe it. So basically what has to happen is like the neurologist, but now it's a machine, looks at your brain waves in real time. And then when you hit this one frequency of your brain wave called alpha, there's this acoustic stimulus that is, you know, released from the headset. And when that acoustic stimulus is timed appropriately with an alpha wave, it like initiates sleep.
But that does sleep initiation, not sleep efficiency though.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So how in the world they came up with this, or like have the bandwidth to think of this, I have no idea. I you know, they are wonderfully brilliant people. Like, you know.
I'll quickly circle back to the story Drew told.
Was that right?
There are articles about this in like relatively legitimate publications, not super legitimate, and it is still pretty dated.
But
like
World War One.
I'm looking at a Business Insider article. The soldier's name was Paul Kern. He was a Hungarian soldier in World War One. He was shot in the head, lost a large portion of his frontal lobe, and then did not sleep again for 40 years. That is the claim, at least. There are like caveats, like his eyes would get tired, so he did have to close his eyes for like an hour a day ish.
Yeah, that's sleep.
And like doctors well, they said if he didn't do it, he would just get headaches and could continue on, apparently. And then like doctors hypothesized that he was doing the like, I forget the term for it, but the thing where you like involuntarily briefly sleep when you're super sleep deprived.
Oh, it's called a hypnagogic hallucination.
Yeah, there were like some doctors who proposed that some of that was going on, but there do seem to be some very.
See, this reminds me of breatharians, if you guys are familiar.
Breatharianism was like the thing at the same time as the binaural beats thing. So this is fantastic.
And what they say is that they will occasionally eat food to remind themselves. If there's any breatharians listening, I apologize, but they occasionally eat food to remind themselves of why they don't need it, which I think, to Allison's point, like that. Okay, so you're eating food. Like that guy was sleeping.
Yeah, energy
just doing
conservation.
it differently.
Yeah. Well, okay, so it makes sense that given his injury, right, he's going to have less restorative sleep, because restorative sleep, at least at that level, is propagated from your frontal cortex. Like it's a connection that involves like, it's called slow wave sleep, and those slow waves like propagate in your frontal cortex. But also the frontal cortex is the most energetically costly metabolically demanding part of the body. And so if you are removing part of that cortex, then hypothetically, your energy demands are reduced. And so you don't need as much sleep because your energy demands are reduced. But that doesn't mean he didn't sleep. It's just his body required less sleep after his injury because of reduced metabolic demands, which on the flip side beautifully explains why athletes need more sleep. Like there's a reason why LeBron and what's the heck's his name? The quarterback for the Seahawks, Marcus, forget his name.
I was going to say Russell Wilson, but he just got traded.
Russell Wilson. That's what I'm thinking of.
He's
Russell
with the
Wilson.
Broncos now.
Oh, he's with the Broncos. Okay.
Yeah.
But that's why they always say like they sleep 11, 12 hours in a 24-hour period with like 8-9 hours at night and then naps throughout the day, is because of what they do. It's metabolically demanding, you know?
Would you?
It's the same thing with the CrossFit team. Like that was the, you know, like that one time when leadership was like, oh, officers need to be officers and they need to have real officers' jobs in addition to training like an elite athlete 5 or 6 hours a day. I'm like, no, we need to like be recovering because we've literally just exhausted all of our energy reserves within those 5 or 6 hours. And I used to hate having to come home and I'd just be so tired that I wouldn't want to like cognitively use my brain at all because I exhausted it all.
That reminds me of when you spoke at the expo, you had this nice graph, I think, and it showed the percentage drop off in performance for like hours lost of sleep or something like that. What was it like? You're down to 30% of max with a minimal amount of sleep deprivation, if I recall.
Yeah. So at 6 hours, you're functioning at 50%, 5 hours, 25%, 4 hours, 15%. That's how we got to change the Army standard. So the Army standard used to be in the field manual, 4 hours of sleep in 24 hours. But after years of doing this research with Dr. Belinkie starting it during the Gulf War and then us doing it on 2 other occasions, that's how we got the Army to move the needle up to 6 hours.
And that's like non-negotiable. I mean, you're not going to hack your way out of that. Like you
can't. No, you can't. I mean, we saw that like, it doesn't matter. Like anytime we did these studies, you can't. I mean, especially when you're operating. The last time we did the study, we were with an armored division and they were doing, you know, marksmanship downrange. And yeah, you can't fake that.
How does caffeine affect that, if at all?
So in the moment, well, genetically, it depends who you are.
Right. Coffee puts
if you're
me to sleep.
sensitive or tolerant, that's going to matter. Caffeine can help if you use that strategic dosing strategy that like the Army developed using non-energy drinks. You know, we can go down my soapbox about that.
We will.
But that's only within the first 24-hour period. So again, it goes back to that research I was talking about, which 3 days of chronic sleep deprivation, caffeine does not work. It literally stops working and only sleep will replace that deficit.
So is there something to be said? Obviously there's something to be said, but the cliche that you see all over the internet of sleep being the most or the best performance enhancing drug.
Oh yeah.
It's that easy.
It's sleep. That easy. It's testosterone. Well, so that's how we get like, I talked about this at H2F day is, you know, that's really how we get a lot of like young athletes and soldiers to listen to us now is we show them that testosterone study, which one they've done for 25 years in the lab at places like University of Chicago. And then also the study we did recently with the Ranger Regiment to show that their testosterone levels like drop by half when they switch from daytime to nighttime operations. Like when people see that and they're like, wait, 6 hours of sleep means my testosterone's 50% less. So that's actually what's interesting is if you take that performance curve of 6 hours of performance or like 6 hours of sleep equating with 50% performance, you see the same thing with testosterone where 6 hours of sleep results in testosterone secretion at only 50%. And like 15% with 4 hours of sleep.
So then is the inverse true, where if you do have lower testosterone, sleep can not replenish it to normal levels, but like, is that something that can help?
Yeah. So if you, but usually those people who have low testosterone, who are otherwise in bed for say 8 or 9 hours, that's usually indicative of a sleep disorder. More than likely, those individuals have sleep apnea because sleep apnea prevents you from getting into those restorative stages of sleep where testosterone is released. Now, for others who routinely get 4 hours of sleep but require 8 hours of sleep, then yeah, they did that to themselves.
I do think so. This gets at a couple things that kind of frustrate me about how the Army approaches sleep. I do think there is a little bit of justification for like limited exposure to sleep deprivation, just to make sure you know the considerations for how to operate under those conditions if that reality comes to pass, right? Like you might need TTPs in place for how you like mitigate risk when you're sleep deprived. That's fine. But given that training is supposed to be about learning, and we know how bad sleep deprivation is for like memory retention and learning new skills and all of those things, and like bigger picture about like the physical resilience of soldiers and testosterone's role in like recovery and performance and all of those things, we're actively undermining both the learning and the physical performance of our force, like almost intentionally. Like we create these scenarios largely on purpose just because of a culture of sleep as a crutch.
Exactly. You can't forget about the interpersonal stuff too, because do you remember at H2F, like my favorite study of all the sleep deprivation studies we did was the threat detection study, when we showed people under sleep deprivation, the positive, neutral, and negative faces. And as soon as they started, getting sleep deprived, meaning they were awake for the normal 16 hours in a day, they started attributing those neutral faces as negative, and the negative faces were they were hypersensitive to. And even some of the positive faces they perceived as negative. So that's really, I think that study is the scariest of them all, because you talk about implicit bias and these like microaggressions, and hopefully not overt aggressions people have when they're sleep deprived. Like that is the crux of it right there.
I mean, I don't know if I've shared the story with Drew. I don't think I have with you, Allison, but my most vivid like sleep in a tactical environment memory comes from an NTC rotation several years ago. And I won't name anybody, but anybody who was in 138 infantry at the time might remember who the people involved in this are. But I walk into the current operations part of the talk, and our deeply, deeply sleep deprived S3 like jerks awake and looks at me and like, "Oh, S2, what's the next chess move?" And I don't really know how to handle that question. So I like kind of tap dance a little bit and start like laying out the most likely course of action we had for the enemy, I guess. And he falls back asleep, like looking at me while I'm trying to answer the question. And so I get like 2 or 3 sentences into my answer and realize he's asleep again. He just like shakes again and like looks at me, and like no memory of what had happened, does the exact same thing. S2, what's the next chess move? And at this point, I like start to worry that I'm getting punked or something. And I just like look over at like other people who are less sleep deprived, and they're just like, yeah, just let him fall back asleep. Don't worry about it. He just stays back there now.
It's like someone's grandfather.
I never want to be an S3.
It's exactly what it was though. He came into it deciding to like charge hard and like essentially stayed awake for 3 days. So he was like going hard for the first 72 hours of the operation, and then just like wasn't with us after that.
I mean, hey, so I'll tell you my sleep deprivation story, because she actually still remembers this. So when we were doing these wearable studies where we would put the sleep wearables on like entire divisions of soldiers, and track them down range, when they were doing their marksmanship exercises, so we could correlate like nighttime sleep amounts with their next day marksmanship performance. I mean, they were awake 40 hours, which meant we had to be awake about 70 hours, right? Straight, because they did their daytime fire, night fire. We had to get there before them, set up all the watches so hundreds of soldiers could get their watches, and then stay later and download all the data right away because we were in an austere environment. And like, if we didn't do it then, we were never going to keep the data. So like at the end of that, I think I was just about getting ready to go to Captain's Careers course at the time. And I was dating this woman named Jess, who happened to have the same name as my branch manager, Jess. And sure enough, I emailed my branch manager a love letter pretty much.
What I'm taking away from this is that the prestigious Walter Reed Army Institute of Research has not really discovered like shifts or like taking care of your own researchers. And now I have a lot of questions about how accurate the data is.
Here's the thing is we were a small team, and you see this a lot with you've probably seen memes online about sleep researchers like just looking like total trash, because it is kind of true.
I don't think as many of us see sleep researcher memes as you think see sleep researcher memes. I'm not sure it's like true. As mainstream.
That is true. But yeah, I mean, you know, sometimes when you do sleep research, it's not all the time, but there's a lot of times where you do middle of the night collections. And like, I mean, I've stayed up for almost 2 days collecting data on more than one occasion. Like I strategically caffeine dose, but I'm still awake. So, but that's the only time I don't practice like what I preach. Normally I try to keep a strict routine. But yeah, she's no longer my branch manager because, you know, she moved on, but yeah, still tells me about the day I wrote her a love letter.
So that brings up an interesting question, because by the time this comes out, I mean, we've done now a couple of conversations around technology specific to sleep, and you don't have, well, I guess maybe you could name brands. Is the tech out there now in terms of the trackers and, you know, rings and watches, and is anything good, or where would you direct people that are interested in that kind of data?
So I will say they each have their own virtues. Some, such as the Aura, you know, the Navy Health Center did a study, is good with sleep staging. The Whoop, that's what I wear. They're great. I mean, you talk about who has changed the culture around sleep. I think Whoop has done that more than anyone. You know, it depends what you want it for. It's just same with like sleep medications, right? Like one, you should only ever take sleep medications when you absolutely need it. But like there's 20 or 30 out there. And so you have to weigh who you are as a person and like why you would take this over another. So I think the thing you have to remember is not to get obsessed with the data. Because ultimately a clinical sleep study is what's going to tell you if you have a sleep disorder or not. Like the wearable can get within target, but it's not the same as looking at brain waves. Like that's what I need to emphasize is brain waves are brain waves, and sleep is by the brain, of the brain, and for the brain. Like, you know.
I do have a question I have to ask to follow that up is, do you have a financial relationship with any of the companies that
yes,
make
I
wearables
should say I do. Full disclosure, I sit on the Women's Performance Collective for Loop because they started, you know, this menstrual coaching platform, and it's such a really cool concept. So yes, I do have a financial disclosure.
Well, hey, but I will back you up because I have no ties to Whoop whatsoever, but I was part of the process that introduced those to Air Force Special Warfare. And I would echo what you said, which is that the data was not, it became a conversation that was less about the data and more about the behavioral change, where just by virtue of people having something, and it could be Whoop, it could be Fitbit, whatever, but by virtue of having something on their wrist and looking at the information, you started to see, I mean, in my particular case, we would see guys compete to get more sleep, which at that point we knew that we had made a difference. And it wasn't necessarily, you know, how accurate is it, more than it changed the way you think about this particular thing, which in that case was sleep.
Yep. No, exactly. And that's what I think a lot of these units are trying to do, is to create, like, we love competing, like with anything in the Army. Like we come up with the most random, you know, competitions, even downrange, for no particular reason but to compete. So like if it works, it works. And if that's how we get to change people's minds about sleep, I'm all for it.
And there is an Army parallel to what you saw with the Air Force too. And Allison probably knows more about the U.S. Army Alaska WHOOP study that went on, but they saw the same thing. I think the study was like supposed to be about like sustained operations in Arctic environment and like different sleep needs under those conditions. But like the key takeaway was that you now have soldiers in the barracks comparing sleep scores and competing on who can sleep more.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was cool.
I will say we did the first wearable sleep study though down in Antarctica. I think I presented that at H2F. Is we brought our wearables down to the southernmost Navy station in Antarctica, probably like 5 or 6 years ago, and the researchers and sailors stationed down there wore them for a whole year, and we got such really cool data to correlate their sleep rhythms, which are very different in austere environments like that, with their behavioral performance and like changes in core body temperature and stuff. It was the coolest study I was ever a part of.
I thought like she said Antarctica, and I was like, oh, surely she meant Alaska. And then she said it again. I was like, no, she went to Antarctica.
No, actually, I didn't get to go because at the time I wish I would have gone, but we worked closely with the Argentinian Navy, so they're the ones who actually went down there.
They're a little closer.
Yeah.
It is. I think there's a whole conversation about that because, like, for those that aren't aware, U.S. Army Alaska / soon to be 11th Airborne Division has been through a lot of stuff over the last few years in terms of like soldier mental health, morale, tension, suicide, all these things. And I think a huge piece of that is related to sleep behaviors in an environment where like the day-night cycle is thrown way off for months of the year. And I mean, I was up at Fort Wainwright having conversations about that a couple of years ago, like within the last 3 years. And at that time, it was like pretty new that they were making blackout curtains and blinds available to soldiers in the barracks. I don't know how you would possibly have any kind of a normal sleep cycle if you did not have access to that up there, because it is actually daylight for like multiple straight months entirely.
Yeah. And that's what we found in the study in Antarctica is like these researchers, like, you know, they would do the tasks they needed to in order to keep everything at the station thriving, because remember, 6 months out of the year, I said this in my talk, they didn't have access to food, water, or medevac. So if something happened, like these people down in Antarctica were on their own. Like there's no boat, no plane, there was nothing that could get to them during the Antarctic winters. And so they will, like, by nature change, because that's how our bodies adapt to light and dark sources. But I will tell you, so I actually have done a lot of research on manipulation and light dark cycles in mice, and in particular hamsters. So when I was a grad student, we actually used to put hamsters in constant light. And when you do that, they turn into psychopaths. Like they literally become so aggressive, and they will literally fight each other to the death that you have to like separate them. And they just become like, I mean, some of them actually do become, you know, if you could diagnose clinical depression in a hamster, like they will become depressed. So it is 100% the extreme light and dark cycles, because animal researchers who have studied the relationship between light cycles and states of mental health for years have known this for like decades.
Well, a huge portion of my dad's side of the family still lives in Alaska, and that all
really?
Like that all makes sense. I believe it tracks with the family. So
like they're all crazy.
It depends on the time of the year.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you, not to go down like a supplement rabbit hole, but I know sleep supplements, I'm thinking off the top of my head, like melatonin, are obviously a hot topic in terms of people that are looking to get better sleep or might have that as like an entryway. What out there, is there anything out there that's worth it, or what out there is worth it?
Yeah. So, you know, I'm always a fan of sleep supplements over sleep medications. Sleep medications, and this is the sentiment across sleep medicine at large, they're a band-aid. If you could holistically fix the problem, starting with structured bedtime routines and napping, I mean, that's the whole concept behind cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. or CBTI, which is the most effective treatment for insomnia today. No supplement, no drug. It's literally like behavioral changes to get better sleep. That's one way to start. But every supplement I think every soldier should take is magnesium. So magnesium is rapidly depleted, especially in tactical athletes. There were studies done years ago at Harvard to show that it's part of the process of like high intensity training. Mostly because magnesium is a critical element for nerve cell communication. And so if you can replenish that during sleep, which is a process of the nervous system, that's one thing. I also actually advocate for creatine. So again, it goes back to like energy conservation and building up energy reserves. If you supplement with creatine and take it before bedtime, it can further amplify the amount of energy reserves that you can utilize for next day performance. If you are going to take a sleep aid, I would do valerian roots. It's been around for like thousands of years. That's a good mild sleep aid. I've heard a little bit of research around tart cherry juice. It's a natural form of melatonin. Now, melatonin is interesting because when people start taking that chronically, it doesn't actually have an impact. The only time it truly has an impact is if you are taking it in the process of changing time zones. Mostly because melatonin, the release of it is timed to the dark cycle. So as soon as it becomes dark or there's darkness around you, you secrete and release melatonin. And so if you're taking a pill form of melatonin coupled with changes in the light dark cycle, if you do it at the right time, it could actually reset your sleep cycle, if that makes sense.
So I like those answers. I don't take a lot of supplements, but I do have, if you go into my kitchen, you will find creatine, you will find vitamin D, and then because of a conversation that we had, Allison, you will also find the magnesium citrate.
Yeah.
But the question I was going to ask that ties to that though is I didn't notice a dramatic change in like sleep outcomes when I started taking magnesium or anything, where the only thing that I really notice dramatic changes in sleep outcomes is all tied to like cell phone use behaviors in the evening.
Yep.
And I know that's annoying because you can't go out and buy that. Like you can't buy a bottle of use your phone less at night. You actually have to change your behavior. But that's like for me, that's like the effect size of that is going to blow away any change in diet or supplements in terms of how those things affect my sleep.
Yeah, 100%. That's where we start at with like soldiers. Like, we've done a lot of these intervention studies in certain units. We did this with the Ranger Regiment. Like, that's where it starts. And it's those little percent changes that seem so silly, but they make all the difference.
So getting close to an hour, I want to like throw not a softball question, but like one of those fast questions at you. If you were handed the keys to the military for a day and could change anything about sleep education, just the culture around sleep, and the answer cannot be sleep more, that's too easy.
No.
What would you change, or what would be kind of the first rock that you kind of see out there that you're like, if we could just fix that one thing?
Oh, that's easy. Put people on missions that most align with their natural sleep schedules. I'm genetically, it's all tied back. It's all based on genetics. Go figure. I'm a genetic vampire. I will never be a general officer in the military because I am not a morning person. I am wake up at 8:30, start thriving around 11. I can burn the midnight candle, and that like my natural bedtime is like 11:30 midnight. My parents are the same way. I have the genetic mutation for it. Remember, I got myself genotyped. So I'd be a great person for like midday and night operations because I could, I could do the shift work better than a morning person. And so that's what I would do. If I had the keys to the military for a day, I would like genotype everyone for this one thing called chronotype of like morning person, evening person, or somewhere in the middle, and put people in certain missions that are like 24 hours on based on like if they're a morning or a night person.
Can you tease that out with like a good questionnaire, or do you have to do the?
Yeah, so there are clinically valid questionnaires. There's a few now. There's the Munich chronotype questionnaire. That's a newer one. It more factors into the like 21st century with technology. The original questionnaire is the Horn Osberg morningness evening scale. That was developed in like the 70s. But either one is good. Actually, when I'm one of the coaches at the Power Athlete Camp every year, and we like do these questionnaires, the morning eveningness questionnaire, and then we do a sleep health questionnaire. And people are always surprised by the chronotype questionnaire, and afterwards they've like come up to me and said like, oh, I changed the time I train from morning to evening, and my performance is that much better. It makes all the difference.
So I'll throw out two quick things that are things I understand from research I've read, and I just want to run them by you to see if they're accurate. One, and this one I think is really cool just based on the kinds of interventions I'm interested in. Sleep does appear to be one where sleep hygiene education does in fact, like in a clinically valid way, improve sleep behaviors and sleep outcomes.
Yep. Yeah.
So that's super exciting to me, because that's something like our performance people out there across the tactical space can do. That's super simple, costs $0. You can teach people sleep hygiene, and that is validated to have an impact on a population scale.
Yeah. Yep. That is a lot of that work was spearheaded at Rare by Dr. Amy Adler. Like, she did a really great job of creating what she calls like a sleep leadership course, because that's really how all this wearable stuff started. Is like we started working and engaging with units, and units who wanted to do better. Now, a lot of the times these units wanted to do better because they had a horrific accident that happened. Like, honestly, that's how we started working with Ranger Regiment, is because of this this fatal accident due to fatigue during this mountain phase of Ranger School with the cadre. But like, I think a lot of units now are starting to see like the benefits and the value that this sleep leadership education has helped soldiers across the board, from, again, mental health and esprit de corps and all that too, that I think a lot of more people are getting on board with it.
So if you're out there listening, like, teaching sleep classes, validated, easy tool to add into your menu of what you offer. And then the other one that I was going to run by you, and I'm pretty confident on my interpretation of this one because I read a bunch of studies. This came up a lot when I was teaching master fitness trainer, and we went to units that had shift work kind of built in. MPs do this a lot. Intel does this a lot. Like SATCOM guys do this a lot. There's a variety of military career fields that shift work is extremely common in. Hospitals. And the bottom line, as I understood it, is that like night shift stuff is pretty inevitably going to come with a degradation of performance. But that can be managed. There are lots of ways with meal timing and timing when you train and all sorts of things you can do to like mitigate that negative impact. But what is going to have the worst possible impact is shifting the shift, like changing the shift you are on more frequently than every 2 weeks.
Yep.
And I just met someone today from the Air Force who the schedule for their unit was, you're going to do 2 days, 2 swings, 2 mids, couple of days off, repeat, which is like, if you had to design something that would ruin sleep as much as possible, that sounds like it.
100%. So I'm not going to name the unit or the organization, but a few years ago, I was involved with a very serious fatal investigation due to fatigue, and this is why is they were aggressively being shifted, and it is so unfortunate that like they never consulted any, because it's not like sleep scientists and chronobiologists are new to the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and even the Marines. Like, Dr. Greg Belinkie and like Commander Chris Field, they've been around for a long time. It's just unfortunately, people haven't listened to us until lives have been lost. And I'm happy to see that's changing now. But yeah, that's like when I started being involved with that investigation, I was like, I mean, it literally took me like 2 minutes of looking at their schedules when I was like, this is why it happened. And then like, I didn't even know what time the actual accident happened, but I sort of predicted seeing what their schedules were. And I was like, oh, okay, this makes sense that the accident happened at this time because of these schedules.
I mean, we have it's programmed into the culture so deeply. I mean, I know when I was a lieutenant, there was the whole thing of like NCOs who do a 24-hour staff duty shift get the day off afterwards, but officers don't, because you got to be tough and you got to just go back to work and suck it up. And so it was like not abnormal. Like we tried to take care of people, right? Like we were reasonable. Everybody's human. You can like get some time off. But I had an XO who was like really into working hard, as XOs tend to be, and would do like a full day of work into a 24-hour staff duty shift and roll straight back into work. And now you're talking about that like 60, 70 hour, like straight going without any sleep thing. And you're going to run into some serious, I mean, we had a guy, it wasn't because of staff duty, it was because of sleep deprivation in the field, but he came out of the field, turned in his rifle, cleaned up his stuff, got in his car and fell asleep at the wheel and broke his leg. And it's
and like, he's lucky he didn't die. I mean, that's what happened to these Ranger cadre. They literally fell asleep at the wheel and crashed into a tree and died. So actually at Rare, when Colonel Tahan was there, we started this thing that after you finished staff duty, you had one of your well-rested soldiers who actually just showed up to work for the day, drive you home, or the command would actually pay for an Uber ride home for you. So you could do staff duty and then like the Army would pay for you to Uber home, which was awesome.
There's so many ways to get after it. And I know you were involved in the sleep chapter of the new doctrine, but we've seen units already since then. I mean, it was happening before the doctrine came out. By the time I was promoting to captain, I was already in a unit where sleep was permitted on staff duty. You had to rotate who was sleeping.
Yeah.
But I saw from a unit recently that there was like a tactical napping SOP associated with staff duty shifts that said like, this is how you're going to do it. And you are going to nap during this shift. Yeah.
They probably got that from us because we did like a staff duty study to show like where exactly it's between like 2 and 4 a.m. because that's when your core body temperature is the lowest. That's when most of these accidents that have happened, that's when they happen. And so we developed like a whole tactical napping protocol around that. So I wonder if they got their hands on it or they just, I mean, more power to whoever set it up, but we need more things like that.
Well, I'm going to have to ask you for that tactical napping protocol so we can get it out as far and wide as we possibly can.
Yeah, sure.
Start taking tactical naps at work. 100%. Where can people find more about you?
Well, you can buy my book, the Meathead, Unraveling the Athletic Brain, available on Amazon. I did through Just Meet Your Wife, and I would have given her a copy of my book. I have plenty of copies in my car.
We're buying it if she hasn't already.
No, she said she did.
I do want you to sign it though now.
Well, I can give you another signed copy.
Perfect.
I am on Instagram, Jock ZZZ.
That's awesome. Well, thanks for coming on and talking about sleep. Not to sound bad, but this makes me tired. He's been slowly turning down the lights, setting the dark mood so he can fall asleep right away afterwards. My sleep hygiene is on point right now.
His dim light melatonin onset going on.
Yeah, he's doing everything right.